Hi friends, and welcome back to No Book Left Behind. I'm your host Mark, and today we'll be discussing the novel The Mind of Mr. Soames and the movie that was made from it. So, The Mind of Mr. Soames, a 1961 British science fiction novel by Charles Eric Maine. That's the subject of discussion today. And if you're familiar with the channel, you'll know I've been doing a series of short videos about books that were turned into movies by Amicus Films in the 1960s and very early 1970s. Now, if you're not familiar with Amicus Films, back in the 1960s and 1970s, they were a principal rival in the UK to the Hammer Horror brand, and they became particularly notable for their anthology horror movies, which starred the likes of Peter Cushing, Christopher Lee, and many other distinguished English actors and actresses of the time. But as well as those, they also dipped their toe into the world of science fiction. And this began with the two Doctor Who movies starring Peter Cushing, which came out in the mid-1960s. And the success of those probably prompted them to try some more standalone science fiction projects, specifically 4 of them, which were all based on novels. And it's those books that I've been talking about in this short series of videos, and also doing a little bit of comparing and contrasting with the movies that Amicus made from them. And I've already talked about 3 of those movie adaptations and the novels they were based on, namely The Wailing Asteroid by Murray Leinster, which became The Terranauts, The Gods Hate Kansas by Joseph J. Millard, which became They Came from Beyond Space, and The Disorientated Man by Peter Saxon, which was adapted into a film called Scream and Scream Again, which starred Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, and Vincent Price. And today it's the turn of The Mind of Mr. Soames, a novel by Charles Eric Maine, originally published in 1961 and turned into a movie which was released in 1970. This is the story of John Soames, a man who was born into a coma 30 years ago and has spent his entire life unconscious, until a Japanese surgeon with a revolutionary new brain surgery technique manages to wake him up. And it's up to the doctors who've been attending him to educate him, to enable him to adjust and integrate into modern society. Unfortunately, it doesn't go well. Now, Maine elects for a very grounded and realistic approach to his story, which is to be applauded. Unfortunately, grounded here means rather dull. The first half of the novel in particular is full of dry academic discussions between the doctors on the best way to educate Soames, and it lacks any real human interest. That may have been the point, because it's this lack of regarding Soames as a person which dooms their efforts to failure. However, it still makes for a rather tiresome reading experience unless you happen to be interested in the fields of education and child psychology. Now, the reader's entry to all this is lead psychiatrist Dr. Dave Conway. Calling him the main character would probably be pushing the definition a bit, as really his presence is more of a storytelling device than anything else. Okay, he does disagree with Institute head man Dr. Brewer about how to go about educating Soames, but their disagreements are really little more than polite discussions over a warm cup of tea. Japanese surgeon Dr. Taketo does have a more radical point of view, but he pretty much keeps it to himself and isn't very proactive in dealing with the situation either. So there is kind of a lack of dramatic conflict in the first half of the novel particularly. Curiously, we also get an insight into Dr. Conway's less than riveting love life. He and colleague Anne Henderson have fallen in love, but the problem is Dave's still married to the flighty Penelope, who has recently left him. Now, very early on in the novel, Penelope gets into a car accident and is paralysed from the waist down. Now, this would seem to be a major, significant plot point when it happens, but she's not mentioned again until literally the last few pages of the novel. It's as if Maine just forgot she existed completely. Now, I'm not sure whether this was designed as some kind of parallel to Soames's situation, being in a hospital and confined, but if it was some kind of comparison intended by the author, I'm afraid it passed over my head completely. Just beyond the halfway point of the novel, Soames escapes from the institution and goes on the run. And thankfully this means an end to all those dry academic discussions, but they're only replaced by a somewhat underwhelming manhunt drama. Okay, there are dramatic possibilities in that situation, particularly when Soames is taken in by frustrated housewife Mrs. Jenny Dewison. This does pay off Conway's often stated concerns about Soames' primal urges, although to be fair I think his strange obsession with those says more about his own private life than anything else. Finally, the book's overwhelming message that innocence is always crushed by adult society is hardly an original concept, and to be honest it's been told elsewhere in a much more compelling way than it is here. And it's fair to say that in general I found the book pretty dull and quite the disappointment. When Amicus went to make the film in 1969, they struck a co-production deal with Columbia Pictures, which had two results. The first being a far bigger budget than they were used to working with, and secondly the presence of American actor Robert Vaughn, who was brought in to sell the film across the pond. Now, if it seems an unusual decision for a big American film company to become involved in this kind of smallish British production, then I do have a suggestion which explains it. On April 14th, 1969, Cliff Robertson took home the Best Actor Oscar for his performance in the title role of the 1968 film Charlie. Now, this was a movie about a man with severe educational difficulties who is turned into a genius thanks to a revolutionary new surgical operation. And it was based on a novel called Flowers for Algernon by Daniel Keyes. Obviously, his character is initially an innocent in a brand new adult world that he's never really known before, and there is a parallel there to Soames' situation. And I wonder if perhaps Columbia saw this and thought that this would be an interesting project to invest in with some potential for success. Now, I have no actual concrete evidence to support that contention, but it does seem like it's a little bit more than a coincidence. The Columbia investment does make for far higher production values than Amicus were used to, particularly if you compare it with a couple of those other movies I've already talked about on this channel that I mentioned earlier, which were clearly made on absolute shoestrings. However, the main benefit was probably the casting, because as well as Vaughan we get Terence Stamp, who was a big star in the 1960s, having come to prominence originally in the 1962 film Billy Budd. We also get wonderful British character actor Nigel Davenport playing the head of the institute, here renamed as Dr. Maitland. And it's the work of these three actors which really is the principal reason for watching the film in the first place. There are also some significant changes in adapting the novel for the screen carried out by writers John Hale and Edward Simpson, and they make some very smart choices. Firstly, there's much more of a focus on Soames rather than the attending physicians, and that allows far greater audience identification with his character. To that end, the wishy-washy Conway, his prospective girlfriend Anne, and his wife Penelope are all gone, and Dr. Takato has become the American Dr. Michael Bergen. Also, Conway's very few character traits have been given to Bergen, and so he is allowed to become much more assertive than the Japanese doctor in the book. Crucially, however, it's the transformation of Dr. Brewer into Dr. Maitland which provides the story with its biggest boost. Rather than the well-meaning but misguided muddler of the novel, this doctor is far more focused on what Soames can do for his professional reputation and the prestige of his institute rather than what they can do for Soames, the human being. The result of this is that the dramatic conflict, largely missing in action in the novel, is here in the film to as much of an extent as it can be, because this is a very faithful adaptation of the novel. Otherwise, the plot develops along exactly the same lines. And although it's always nice to see a faithful adaptation of a book, sometimes if the book's not that great in the first place, it does result in a disappointing movie. In the end, I couldn't help but wonder if this is one of these story ideas that initially seems to be bursting with possibilities, but when you examine it more closely, you realise that there are very limited opportunities for interesting development. So those are my thoughts on The Mind of Mr. Soames. Have you read the book? Have you seen the movie? Do you agree with my opinions? Please let me know in the comments below. And thank you for staying with me until the end of this video. And if you enjoy my content, please consider liking, subscribing, or ringing that notification bell so you don't miss a single video. And in the meantime, please don't forget to keep looking through those second-hand bookshops in those narrow side streets of your city. Please keep going to those car boot sales and charity shops, because there are treasures out there that only you can find. Be seeing you.